The rain against the window pane was a steady, forgiving rhythm, a stark contrast to the frantic, stolen beat inside Arthur's study. It was well past 2 in the morning, a time when the house was supposed to be sleeping, shrouded in a respectable silence. But here, in this room lined with books and achievements, a different kind of story was being written in whispers and sighs. His fingers were tangled in her dark hair, not with the gentle caress he reserved for his wife, Eleanor, but with a desperate, possessive grip, as if he could hold on to this moment and keep the dawn from ever breaking. A soft sound, half sob, half surrender, escaped her lips as he pressed her against the heavy mahogany desk. "Isabella," he breathed, his voice rough, choked with a feeling he refused to name. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her face a canvas of conflicting emotions, shame, desire, and a heartbreaking vulnerability that fueled his own reckless need. "Arthur, no. We shouldn't," she whispered, the words a feeble protest against the tide pulling them both under. But her body, arching into his, told a different story, a story of pure, undeniable need that mirrored the emptiness inside him. His gaze fell to the floor, to the pool of black lace and silk discarded carelessly on the expensive Persian rug. It was Eleanor's lingerie, a gift he had bought for their anniversary, a piece she had acknowledged with a cool, appreciative smile but had never worn. It had sat in its box for months, a symbol of the beautiful, untouchable distance that had become their marriage. And now, here it was, a silent witness to a different kind of devotion, a more primal, more honest one. The faint, expensive scent of Eleanor's perfume still clung to the fabric, rising from the floor to mix with the heated human smell of their bodies, a perfume of guilt and ecstasy. He looked down at the girl in his arms, the maid, who was now so much more than a servant, and he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating that this was not just about lust. It was about the profound, aching silence of his life, a silence that, for this one stolen moment, was finally, blessedly filled. Before the frantic, stolen moments in the dead of night, there was the silence, a profound architectural silence that was the true foundation of Arthur's life. The house in Scarsdale was a masterpiece of modern design, a symphony of glass, steel, and clean lines that Arthur himself had created. It was featured in magazines, a testament to his success, a physical manifestation of a life built with precision and control. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating minimalist furniture, curated art, and floors so polished they reflected the empty, cloudless sky. Everything had its place. There were no stray papers, no sentimental clutter, no sign of the messy, unpredictable chaos of a life truly lived. It was less a home and more a gallery, a showroom for a life of impeccable taste and quiet success, and his wife Eleanor moved through these spaces like a piece of living art herself. Eleanor was beautiful, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. She ran one of Manhattan's most influential contemporary art galleries, a world as sleek and demanding as their home. Her beauty was like the house, flawless, angular, and cool to the touch. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled. Her designer clothes hung on her frame with an effortless grace, and her smile, while dazzling, rarely seemed to reach the cool blue of her eyes. Theirs was a marriage admired by all who saw it from the outside. They were a power couple, their names whispered with a mix of envy and respect at the charity galas and exclusive dinners they frequented. They were a perfect pairing, a merger of two successful brands, their life a testament to shared goals and mutual ambition. But a brand is not a bond, and a partnership is not passion. Their conversations had become exercises in logistics. Schedules were synchronized, not hearts. They discussed investments, social obligations, and the maintenance of their pristine home. Affection was dispensed in polite, measured doses, a brief kiss that barely brushed the cheek as one of them left for the day, a perfunctory "I love you" spoken into a phone before hanging up. There was no animosity, no fighting, just a vast, peaceful, and utterly desolate emptiness between them. They were two ships passing in the night, signaling to each other with polite horns before continuing on their separate parallel courses. Eleanor was not cruel. She was simply absent. Her energy was consumed by her work, her artists, her clients. Her days were a meticulously curated schedule of gallery openings, board meetings, and lunches with people whose names appeared in society columns. She would return home late, smelling of expensive perfume and the electric buzz of the city, bringing with her a gust of cold air and a weariness that left little room for him. And so, Arthur was often alone. He was alone in a house that could comfortably host 100 people, his solitude amplified by the cavernous spaces and the echoing quiet. He would sit at the head of a long marble dining table, a single place setting before him, the sound of his fork against the porcelain plate seeming obscenely loud in the stillness. He would eat the meal prepared by their cook, look out at the manicured gardens bathed in the soft glow of landscape lighting, and feel an ache so profound it was almost a physical pain. He had everything a man was supposed to want. He had achieved every goal he had ever set for himself. He was living the dream he had designed on paper, and yet he felt like a ghost haunting the blueprint of his own life. His sanctuary and his prison was his study, the very room where he would one day betray everything he had built. In the long, quiet evenings, he would retreat there, the heavy door closing with a soft, final click, shutting out the silence of the house, only to trap him in the silence of his own mind. He would sit in his expensive leather chair, the scent of old books and architectural paper a familiar comfort. He would trace the blueprints of multi-million-dollar homes for other wealthy, successful families, meticulously planning spaces for them to live and love and fight and grow. He could architect a bridge of steel and concrete to span a river, yet he couldn't build one across the silent expanse of his own marriage. He would stare at the photos on his desk, a smiling, perfect photo from their wedding day, another from a gala where they looked like royalty, and he would feel nothing but a sense of profound dislocation, as if he were looking at the life of a stranger. The loneliness was a quiet poison. It wasn't a sharp, sudden pain, but a slow, creeping numbness that deadened the world around him. The vibrant colors of the artwork Eleanor so loved looked flat to his eyes. The complex flavors of the expensive wines he drank tasted of nothing. He had forgotten the sound of genuine, unforced laughter in his own home. He began to crave imperfection. He found himself yearning for a crack in the polished facade, a smudge on the pristine glass, a single, unplanned note in their perfectly composed symphony. He wanted to feel something, anything, other than this polite, managed, and soul-crushing emptiness. The silence in the house was not peaceful. It was a presence, a weight that settled in his chest and made it difficult to breathe. He was suffocating in perfection. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that the waiting itself had become a form of suffering. And in a life so meticulously planned, it is always the unplanned that arrives with the most devastating force. He just didn't know that it would arrive so quietly, so humbly, in the form of a new maid with downcast eyes and a name he would soon be unable to stop whispering in the dark. She arrived on a Tuesday, a quiet whisper in a house that only knew a deafening silence. The agency had sent a new maid to replace the last one, an older woman who had been as neat and impersonal as the house itself. But Isabella was different. She was not the polished, perfect beauty of Eleanor, but a different kind entirely. A softer, more muted kind, with a face that seemed to have been drawn with a charcoal pencil, all soft shadows and delicate lines. Her hair was a deep, unassuming brown, often tied back in a simple bun, and her uniform, a plain black dress with a white apron, seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the quiet intelligence in her eyes and the gentle movements of her hands. In the beginning, Arthur barely noticed her. She was just another element in the meticulously managed choreography of his life. But after the first week, something shifted. He found himself lingering in the library, not because he was reading, but because he knew she would be in there, dusting the rows of books he had never truly cared about. He would sit in his leather chair, the book open in his hands, and simply watch her. He was surprised to find himself doing it. He, a man whose mind was supposed to be consumed with blueprints and deadlines, was captivated by the sheer, quiet grace of this young woman. He noticed the way she handled the fragile antique vases with a tender care he hadn't seen in this house for years. He saw the small, focused frown on her face as she worked a stubborn smudge out of a glass pane. The desire wasn't sexual, not yet. It was something far more insidious. It was about seeing life, true, unvarnished life, moving through the cold, beautiful shell of his existence. He found his gaze lingering on the delicate curve of her neck as she bent to clean, on the way a stray strand of hair would fall across her cheek, and she would tuck it back with a swift, unconscious motion. It was a small, fleeting glimpse of something unguarded, something real in a world defined by its impeccable facades. He started finding excuses to talk to her. He would ask about the specific cleaning solution she was using, or where she had found a particularly lovely antique polish. The conversations were always about the house, but they were never really about the house. He was searching for a crack, a space where he could insert a question about her life, her thoughts. Her answers were always brief, deferential, her eyes lowered to the floor as she spoke. She would call him sir, her voice a soft, musical counterpoint to the quiet hum of the house's ventilation system. But there was a spark in her eyes when she finally raised them to meet his, a quiet intelligence he couldn't ignore. It was in those fleeting glances that he felt the first thrilling, terrifying tremor of a coming fall. One afternoon, he found her in the conservatory, a space filled with potted ferns and orchids that Eleanor had purchased to give the house a touch of nature, but rarely bothered to tend. Isabella was kneeling by a single rosebush that looked weak and neglected, her fingers gently touching a small, budding rose. It was the first time he saw her truly relaxed, her shoulders slumped with a soft, natural ease. He stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched her. The look on her face, a look of quiet affection for something so simple and so alive, struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a look he had never seen on Eleanor's face, not for the art, not for the house, not even for him. Eleanor's attention was always a transaction, a focus on what was next. Isabella's was a presence, a singular devotion to the thing in her hands. He cleared his throat, and she jumped, startled, her cheeks flushing a faint rose color that was more beautiful than any of the expensive pigments Eleanor used to paint her own face. She apologized, explaining that the plant looked thirsty. He waved a hand dismissively, telling her not to worry. The conversation died, but the moment did not. The image of her, on her knees, giving her quiet care to a dying rose was branded into his mind. He found himself mentally tracking her movements through the house. When he was in his study, he would find himself waiting for the sound of her in the next room, the faint jingle of keys, the soft tread of her shoes on the hardwood floor. The sound of her quiet humming from the kitchen was the only music in his otherwise silent world. He started scheduling his days around her. He would return home early from the office, telling his assistant he had a headache, just to find a reason to be in the house when she was. He would catch himself smiling as she passed in the hall, a silent, ridiculous smile that felt more real than any polite grin he had offered in years. This wasn't an infatuation with a beautiful woman. It was a deep-seated craving for warmth, for the quiet presence of someone who made him feel seen, not for his status or his achievements, but for his simple humanity. She was a single drop of clean water in the sterile, air-filtered dryness of his life, and he was beginning to realize he was profoundly thirsty. The house was still a masterpiece, the marriage still a partnership, but a new dangerous variable had been introduced. She wasn't just the maid who cleaned his home. She was the quiet girl who was, without even trying, beginning to clean out the cobwebs of his soul. And as he watched her disappear around a corner, the scent of fresh soap and human warmth lingering in the sterile air, he knew he was already lost. The library was Arthur's refuge, a place where he could hide from the polite emptiness of his life. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, the soft light of the setting sun filtered through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. He had come here with no purpose, only the familiar, gnawing feeling of a man with too much time and not enough to fill it. Isabella was in the far corner, her back to him, quietly straightening a shelf of leather-bound volumes, her movements as fluid and silent as a cat. He watched her for a moment, a ritual he had become accustomed to, feeling the familiar pull of her presence. He decided to break the silence. He walked toward her, a question about a particular antique book forming on his tongue. But his mind was somewhere else, caught in the quiet rhythm of her work. He reached for a volume on a high shelf, a book on French Impressionism he had never read, and his fingers, clumsy with a sudden, uncharacteristic nervousness, fumbled. The heavy book slipped from his grasp. It was a small, mundane catastrophe, a tiny crack in the perfectly controlled veneer of his life. She reacted instinctively, her hands darting out to catch it. Time seemed to slow. He saw the swift arc of her arm, the blur of her fingers as they moved to intercept the falling object. And then, their hands collided, a jarring, shocking connection that was nothing like the soft, polite brushes of fingers he had experienced for years. Her fingers, cool and smooth from the polish she had been using, brushed against his. The shock was not painful, but it was absolute. It was a sudden, unexpected jolt that ran up his arm and settled like an electric charge in the pit of his stomach. It was a tremor that rattled the very foundation of his carefully constructed world. For a single, suspended second, neither of them moved. Their hands remained clasped around the book, his large and weathered, hers slender and delicate. The book was a bridge between them, a fragile object holding a weight it was never meant to bear. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. They both pulled their hands away as if burned, and the book fell to the floor with a soft, final thud. Neither of them looked at the book. They were looking at each other. Her eyes, usually lowered, were wide with a mix of surprise and a fear he couldn't place. His gaze, usually so controlled and distant, was open and raw. The quiet in the library, which had always felt like an absence, now felt like a presence, charged and heavy with the things they hadn't said. She bent down, her movements quick and flustered, to retrieve the book. "I'm so sorry, sir," she murmured, her voice a barely audible whisper. "No," he said, his own voice sounding foreign and rough. "It was my fault. I was distracted." The moment passed. She placed the book back on the shelf, her back to him, and he returned to his chair, his hands now resting uselessly in his lap. But the moment did not leave him. He sat there for a long time, the words he was supposed to say, the questions about the book, the thanks for her quick reflexes dying on his lips. He kept flexing his fingers, as if to feel her touch again. He could still feel the phantom warmth of her fingers on his, the ghost of her touch, a small but undeniable fire in the coldness of his skin. He had touched countless people in his life, handshakes with clients, the polite embraces of business acquaintances, the dutiful kisses of his wife. Eleanor's touch was predictable, polite. It was a habit, a period at the end of a sentence. It was a known quantity. Isabella's was an ellipsis. It was an unfinished thought, a breath held too long, a promise of more. He had believed his loneliness was a state of mind, a psychological affliction. But that single electric touch had revealed it to him as a physical ailment, a profound starvation for human connection, a hunger for the simple, elemental warmth of another person. The sterile air in the house, once merely a comfort, now felt like a suffocating vacuum. The next few days were a quiet torment. He found himself mentally tracking her movements with a desperate new intensity. He would imagine his fingers tracing the curve of her hand, the delicate bones beneath her skin. He wasn't just observing her anymore, he was craving her. His desire had a new language now, a new grammar. It was a language of touch, a grammar of silent, imagined caresses. He would watch her, and he could feel a phantom heat rising in his chest. He was no longer content to simply watch the beautiful, living thing moving through his perfect, dead house. He wanted to touch it again. He needed to. The polite, comfortable distance between them had been irrevocably shattered by a single, accidental brush of hands, and in the ruins of that moment, a dangerous, thrilling inevitability began to take root. He was no longer a man content to be a ghost in his own life. He was a man about to become a transgression. Eleanor's absence was not a void in the house, but a presence. She had flown to Paris for a gallery exhibition, a week-long immersion in a world of art and commerce that was exclusively hers. Her departure had been a whirlwind of assistance and luggage, a final, perfunctory kiss, and a promise to call. Once the door clicked shut, the silence that settled over the house was different. It was no longer heavy and lonely, but light and promising. Arthur found himself almost giddy with a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years, a dangerous, thrilling feeling that was less about being unburdened and more about being unobserved. He had a purpose for her to stay late, a legitimate, if flimsy, pretext. The attic was in need of organizing, full of old documents and boxes of photos he and Eleanor had accumulated over their 15-year marriage. It was a task that had been on his to-do list for months, a task he would have normally delegated to a service or ignored completely. But tonight, it was a reason. He called her into his study, a place that was always his and his alone. "Isabella," he said, the sound of her name on his tongue, a soft rebellion. "I was hoping you could help me with something." The attic needs organizing, and it's a two-person job. I'd be happy to pay you overtime." She agreed with her usual quiet politeness, her eyes meeting his with that now familiar spark of intelligence. They went upstairs, the attic's vast, dusty expanse, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the floors below. As they worked, the silence that had so often felt empty began to fill with the sounds of their collaboration. The creak of old floorboards, the rustle of paper, the quiet murmur of his voice as he explained what to keep and what to discard. He found himself asking questions he hadn't planned, his words veering away from the boxes and toward her. He asked about her family, the small village she had come from, the university she attended. He learned that her family was far away, that she studied literature, and that her dream was to one day be a translator. The work was slow, but the conversation was easy. He found a half-empty bottle of wine he had left in the attic after an old party, and, on a whim, he found 2 clean glasses in a nearby box. "It's been a long day," he said, a simple phrase that felt like a code for something much more complex. He poured a glass for her, and for himself. It was a small, transgressive act. He was no longer her employer. He was just a man sharing a glass of wine with a woman in the dusty quiet of an attic. He began to talk about himself, not the public-facing version of Arthur, the successful architect, but the private man, the one who lived in the silence. He spoke of his perfect life as if it were a beautiful, cold cage. He spoke of the solitude that gnawed at him, the feeling of being a ghost in his own life. He didn't know why he was sharing this with her, a near stranger, but her presence, her quiet, genuine attention, was like a well he hadn't known he was thirsty for. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She simply listened, her eyes fixed on his with a quiet, genuine empathy that was more powerful than any words could ever be. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own loneliness, not with judgment, but with a silent understanding that made him feel more seen than he had in years. Then, it was her turn. She spoke of her life, a life so different from his, yet so full. She spoke of a small apartment she shared with a roommate, the late nights studying under a single lamp, the feeling of finally belonging somewhere, even though she was far from home. Her story was simple, human, and full of a quiet grace that humbled him. She didn't speak of grand dreams or vast ambitions, but of small, tangible hopes, finishing her degree, helping her family, finding her place in this new, complicated world. He saw beyond the maid's uniform, beyond the respectful demeanor. He saw a soul, brave and fragile and full of quiet dreams. He realized he was not just talking to the help, he was talking to a person. They finished the wine, the last of the boxes were sealed, and the night had grown deep. The air in the attic was thick with dust, and a kind of charged intimacy that hung in the air between them. He felt a desperate urge to prolong the moment, to not let her go. "I should drive you home," he said, the words slipping out without thought. It was another line crossed. She accepted, and the drive felt shorter than it should have. They spoke little, but the silence was not the one he was used to. It was comfortable, full of the echo of their shared vulnerabilities. When they reached her apartment, she thanked him, her eyes filled with a gratitude that felt more valuable than any currency. "Thank you, Arthur," she said, using his first name for the first time, a small, subtle shift that felt like a seismic event. "Thank you for listening." He wanted to tell her that it was he who should be thanking her, that she had given him more in a few hours than his entire life had in a year, but he said nothing. Their hands didn't touch, but their eyes did. It was a silent acknowledgement of what had passed between them, a shared secret that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He returned to the empty house, the perfect silence once again settling around him, but it was no longer an empty void. It was filled with the echo of her voice, the memory of her empathy, the simple, quiet story of her life. He sat in his study, the room where the affair had opened in a flurry of lust, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the house was no longer his alone. A part of him had been given away in that single stolen evening, a part of him that now belonged to a quiet girl with a story in her eyes and the promise of warmth in her soul. He had invited her into his home, but she, without even knowing it, had invited herself into his heart. And in the dead of the night, a new, far more dangerous hunger was born. Eleanor's bedroom was a study in immaculate design, a shrine to her taste and his success. The massive, four-poster bed was a piece of custom-made art, its high thread count sheets always crisp and white. Silk drapes hung from the windows, filtering the light in a way that made the room feel both serene and strangely cold. It was a place of physical closeness that held no emotional warmth, a perfect sanctuary that had long ceased to feel like a home to Arthur. And it was here, in this sacred, sterile space, that the fragile barrier between their two worlds finally crumbled. Eleanor had been gone for 4 days, and with her absence, the house had taken on a life of its own. The silence was no longer a wait, but an invitation. Arthur felt a restless energy, a kind of hopeful dread, knowing that sooner or later, something had to happen. He had spent the last 2 days replaying the memory of their conversation in the attic, the sound of her voice, the sincerity in her eyes. He was a man suspended between two lives, and the suspension was beginning to feel unbearable. Isabella was cleaning the master bedroom, a task she had always approached with a meticulous reverence for Eleanor's things. Arthur found himself drawn to the room. He walked in, intending to simply retrieve a book, but his eyes were immediately drawn to the bed. On the edge of the pristine, unmade sheets lay a small black box with a gold ribbon. It was the same one he had given Eleanor for their anniversary. Inside, she had found an impossibly delicate piece of black lace lingerie, a negligee that was more an act of art than an article of clothing. Eleanor had simply smiled, thanked him, and placed it in the box, untouched, unworn, an acknowledgement of his gesture that carried the same distance as their marriage itself. Isabella saw it too. As she folded a silk pillowcase, her eyes fell upon the open box. She knew it belonged to the lady of the house, a piece of something beautiful and impossibly expensive. A whisper of a thought, a sudden, powerful impulse, stirred within her. She shouldn't have been looking, shouldn't have been touching, but a moment of sheer irrational curiosity took hold. She ran her fingers over the sheer, intricate lace. It was so unlike the simple cotton fabrics of her own world. It was a tangible piece of the luxury that surrounded her, a luxury she was only ever meant to clean. And then, in a moment of pure, unthinking weakness, she did it. She slid the negligee over her simple uniform dress, and then, with a nervous, fumbling motion, she let the dress fall to the floor. She stood there, in the middle of Eleanor's perfect room, the black lace, a stark, sensual contrast to her plain, unadorned skin. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror, a fleeting, forbidden image of what she was not, and a shiver of both shame and wild, secret pleasure ran through her. It was in that precise, breathtaking moment that Arthur opened the door. He saw her, and the world tilted on its axis. He had expected to see a maid dutifully folding his wife's clothes. He had not expected to see the maid, naked save for the very piece of lingerie his wife had refused to wear. It was his wife's lust, draped over his maid's innocence. It was a visual betrayal so raw and so complete that it silenced every rational thought in his head. Her eyes went wide with a terror he had never seen before. Her hands flew up to cover herself, but it was a futile, desperate gesture. A rush of crimson flooded her cheeks, a flush of utter shame and mortification. She looked at him, her body frozen, her mind screaming. The silence between them was not quiet. It was a roar, a storm of unspoken desires and unspeakable truths. He stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. It was not anger he felt, but a white-hot, singular, and undeniable lust that was 1,000 times more potent than any he had ever known. It was born of forbidden fruit, of transgression, of the absolute, beautiful wrongness of the entire situation. He didn't move. He simply stared, taking in every single detail, the way the sheer fabric clung to the gentle curve of her hips, the way the delicate lace rested against the pale skin of her shoulders, the way the soft light from the window made her skin glow. She was the first to speak, her voice a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry, sir. I don't know why." The words were an apology, a desperate plea for understanding. But he was beyond understanding. He was consumed. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with a soft, final click. "Don't be sorry," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a tone she had never heard him use. It looks better on you than it ever could on her." The words hung in the air, a final, irrevocable statement. He had made his choice. She had made hers. The quiet girl who cleaned his house, the man who lived in a cage of his own making, they were both now standing on the same side of a line that had just been erased. He moved slowly toward her, his eyes never leaving hers, and she did not run. She did not try to cover herself again. She simply stood there, a trembling, vulnerable silhouette in black lace, and watched him come, knowing, with a deep and unsettling certainty, that the point of no return had already passed. And in that one stolen moment, as the black lace fell to the floor and the first of his fingers touched her skin, he knew that his life, his perfect, broken life, would never, ever be the same. He moved toward her with a quiet, devastating certainty, a man who had finally found the key to his own cage. The air in the room, still thick with the lingering scent of Eleanor's perfume, was now charged with a new, potent electricity. She didn't run, didn't scream. She simply stood, a deer frozen in the headlights of a reality she had chosen to stumble into. Her eyes, wide with a mix of terror and an undeniable curiosity, watched him as he approached. He reached for her, and his hands, which had built empires of steel and glass, were now clumsy and trembling. He touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away the single tear that had fallen. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice a low, choked plea. I've wanted this." The words were an apology and a confession rolled into one, a desperate attempt to give voice to a hunger that had lived inside him for years. Her response was a small, shuddering breath. "No, Arthur, please." The protest in her voice was a single trembling thread against the undeniable fact of her stillness, her willingness to stay. He leaned in and kissed her, his mouth finding hers, a desperate, fumbling search that tasted of salt and shame and a terrifying, beautiful release. It was not a kiss of romance, but of reclamation. He was reclaiming a part of himself he had long since given up for lost. He reached for the simple buttons of her maid's uniform, his fingers fumbling with a clumsy urgency he hadn't known in decades. The white apron, the black dress, the layers of their professional barrier, they all came undone, each button a small, deliberate act of rebellion. The fabric slid from her shoulders and fell to the floor in a whisper of a sound, a silent surrender. The sight of her body, in the soft, filtered light of the bedroom, was a landscape he had only dreamed of touching. Her skin was pale and impossibly soft, a canvas of imperfections and curves that was so achingly, beautifully human. He didn't move fast, not at first. The urgency was there, but it was tempered by a kind of awed reverence. He traced the line of her collarbone with his fingertip, a silent question. Her answer was a soft gasp, a slight tilt of her head, and a subtle shiver that was both from the cold and from the thrill of his touch. He pushed the straps of her bra down, the fabric giving way with a silent, breathless plea. He saw the gentle, full curve of her breasts, a sight he had only imagined in his darkest, loneliest hours. He lowered his head, and in that moment, the sterile perfection of the room, the scent of Eleanor's perfume, the weight of his guilt, it all faded away. There was only the warmth of her skin, the racing beat of her heart beneath his hand, the raw, intoxicating reality of her presence. The silence of the house outside was a distant world. In here, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing, the soft thud of their clothes on the floor, and the low, choked murmur of his voice against her skin. He was no longer Arthur, the cold architect. She was no longer Isabella, the quiet maid. They were simply two bodies, two souls starved for a connection, desperate to feel something real in a world of polished surfaces and polite half-truths. He moved with a kind of brutal gentleness, his movements a testament to both his deep craving and his unpracticed fumbling. He kissed her neck, her shoulder, the soft hollow of her throat, each kiss a whispered confirmation of his desire. He lifted her and carried her to the bed, the familiar place of his perfect empty marriage. But it was not empty anymore. He felt the soft give of the mattress beneath them, the tangled mess of their limbs, the reckless, beautiful abandon that had taken hold of them both. The dialogue was minimal, broken by gasps and sighs. "God, Isabella, I've needed this so badly," he groaned, his voice rough and thick with emotion. Her response was a gasp of his name, a sound of pure, unadorned pleasure, a perfect punctuation to his desperate words. "Oh, Arthur." she cried out softly, her voice a symphony of surrender and delight. He felt her hands in his hair, her fingers gripping his back, her body arching into his with a force that was all her own. It was a mutual, overwhelming surrender, a kind of falling that was no longer an accident, but a choice. The moment was over, and in its place, the cold reality of the room began to seep back in. They lay tangled in the high thread count sheets, the sheets that had always felt so cold and impersonal. But now, they felt warm, full of a life they had just created. He looked down at her, at the flush on her cheeks, the sleepy contentment in her eyes that had replaced the terror. The guilt, a quiet poison, began to creep back into his veins. It was the price of this moment, a toll he would have to pay forever. He had just betrayed everything he had built, with a woman who was a walking, breathing contradiction to his entire life. He held her, not in triumph, but in a kind of quiet, stunned sorrow, knowing that in the space of a single, reckless fall, they had broken something so completely that it could never be put back together. The black lace, a silent witness to their crime, lay on the floor, a single, forgotten tear from his perfect, broken life, leaving them with nothing but the raw, thrilling, and terrifying truth of their desires. The days that followed were a quiet, charged dance. The rigid lines of their old reality had been shattered, and in the space between the fragments, a new, secret world was beginning to form. Isabella was no longer just the maid, and Arthur was no longer just her employer. They were co-conspirators, guardians of a secret so potent it seemed to hum in the very air between them. When she moved through the house, her quiet efficiency was now layered with a new awareness, a subtle sensuality in the way she walked, the way she would glance at him over her shoulder. He would watch her, and a silent, illicit conversation would pass between them, a shared memory, a shared hunger, a shared guilt. Eleanor's return was a ticking clock, a deadline that hung over their heads, and this knowledge did not breed caution. It bred desperation. The first time had been a fall, an accident of overwhelming desire. The second time would be a choice, a deliberate, conscious step off the ledge. It happened on a Friday afternoon, 2 days before Eleanor was due to fly home. The sun was high and bright, flooding the house with a harsh, unforgiving light. The risk was a tangible thing, a third person in the room with them. A delivery could arrive, a gardener could walk past a window, a neighbor could call. The world, which had seemed so distant during their first nocturnal encounter, was now pressed up against the glass, watching. Arthur was in the grand living room, a space designed by Eleanor to showcase their success. It was a room of pale colors, expensive art, and a vast white silk sofa that was more a sculpture than a piece of furniture. It was the very heart of their public life, the stage upon which they played the part of the perfect couple for their guests. To bring their secret here was an act of profound defiance. He was reading a book, or pretending to, when Isabella entered with a feather duster. She began her work, moving around him with a practiced, respectful distance, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. He didn't say a word, but his eyes, dark with a hunger that was now familiar to her, said everything. He watched her, and he waited. She moved closer, dusting a table near his chair, and her arm brushed against his shoulder. It was a feather-light touch. Perhaps an accident, perhaps not, but it was enough. He reached out and caught her hand, his fingers closing around her wrist. She stopped, her body going still, the feather duster held suspended in midair. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw not a request, but a statement of fact. This was going to happen. He stood up, slowly pulling her toward him, and she did not resist. She let the duster fall from her hand, its soft, white feathers scattering on the polished floor, a tiny surrender. This time there was no fumbling, no clumsy urgency of the first fall. His hands were steady as he unbuttoned her uniform, his movements slow and deliberate, a ritual of desecration in this sacred room. He pushed the simple black dress from her shoulders, and it pooled around her feet, leaving her standing before him in the bright afternoon light. The sunlight that poured through the massive windows was not a soft, forgiving light, but a harsh, revealing one. It illuminated every detail of her skin, every curve, every imperfection, making their transgression feel all the more audacious. "You're so beautiful in the light," he murmured, his voice thick with a raw, almost painful sincerity. I feel like I'm seeing you for the first time." He pulled her down onto the white silk sofa, a piece of furniture so expensive and impractical that Eleanor had forbidden anyone from even sitting on it too casually. The act was a silent, violent rejection of everything that room represented. Her skin was a warm, living contrast to the cool, sterile silk. He kissed her, and this time, the kiss was not one of desperation, but of a deep, knowing intimacy. He knew the taste of her now, the soft pressure of her lips, the way she sighed into his mouth. "Arthur, what if someone sees?" She whispered against his lips, her voice a mix of thrilling fear and breathless desire. "What if she comes home early?" The fear in her voice was an aphrodisiac, a spice that made the moment all the more potent. "Let them see," he said, a reckless, foolish statement born of pure, unadulterated need. For now, there is only this. He was a man drowning, and she was the only breath of air in the world. He didn't care about the consequences. He only cared about the feeling of being alive. Every sound from the outside world was a potential threat. A delivery truck rumbling down the street, a neighbor's dog barking, the phantom sound of Eleanor's car in the driveway. The risk sharpened their senses, heightened their pleasure. It was a frantic, desperate coupling, fueled by the knowledge that their time was limited, that this stolen paradise was a fleeting, fragile thing. The sunlight painted stripes across her back as she arched beneath him, and he traced the lines with his finger, a man worshipping at an altar he had just built in the ruins of his own life. The dialogue was no longer just gasps of a name, but a soft, urgent language of pleasure. "Tell me," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Tell me what you want." And she did, her soft instructions a testament to the new, dangerous equality that had formed between them. The climax was a rushed, frantic release, a shared, silent scream against the possibility of being discovered. The aftermath was just as hurried. The act of dressing was as intimate as the act of undressing, but charged with a different energy, the frantic energy of conspirators covering their tracks. He helped her with the buttons of her dress, his fingers brushing against her skin one last time. She smoothed the cushions on the silk sofa, erasing any trace of their sin. The room was returned to its pristine state, the stage reset for the perfect couple's return. She picked up her feather duster, and, with one last, lingering look, she left the room, her face flushed, her hands trembling slightly. Arthur was left alone, standing in the center of the grand living room, the ghost of their act hanging in the sunlit air. He looked around the perfect room, at the perfect furniture, and for the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt haunted, not by a ghost, but by a memory so vibrant and so real that it made everything else in his life feel like a pale imitation. The fall was complete. Now, he was simply learning how to live in the wreckage. He was no longer a lonely man who had made a mistake. He was an adulterer, and he was an addict. Eleanor returned from Paris like a storm of perfectly orchestrated grace. She swept back into the house, bringing with her the scent of a different country, the hum of a different life, and the same cool, unbreachable distance she had left behind. The house, which had become a playground for a stolen, reckless intimacy, reverted to its former state, a gallery of beautiful, cold art. The secret was now a living, breathing thing that they had to hide, a ghost that haunted every room, every hallway, every quiet moment. Their affair was no longer just about stolen afternoons on a silk sofa. It was about the small, quiet moments that no one else could see. It was a secret language they had created for themselves, a vocabulary of glances and subtle gestures. A shared look across the dining table when Eleanor was mid-sentence about a client, the briefest of smiles as Isabella passed him in the hall, a quiet, knowing look from him as she polished a piece of furniture, a silent question about her night, about her thoughts. These were their new intimacies, the tiny, stolen treasures that felt more valuable than any reckless physical act. The most dangerous part of it all was the phone. His phone, once a tool for business, became a source of both torment and ecstasy. The late-night texts, sent in the dark while Eleanor lay sleeping beside him, were a lifeline. They were not explicit. There was no need for that. The intimacy was in the simplicity of the words. "Are you okay?" He would type, the screen a glowing, forbidden window into her world. And her reply, always brief but achingly sincere, would arrive a moment later. "I'm okay. Thank you." Or, "I'm thinking about you." Each text was a small, silent transgression, a pinprick of rebellion that kept the feeling of being alive from fading away. The physical was now a symptom, a consequence of a deeper, more profound connection. He found himself confessing to her, in those hushed, late-night conversations on the phone, things he hadn't told anyone, not even Eleanor. He spoke of the pressure of his life, the emptiness he had felt for so long, the suffocating burden of his own success. He spoke of his fears, his insecurities, the feeling of not being enough. She didn't offer him solutions. She simply listened, and in her quiet, patient empathy, he found a kind of solace he had never known. She was not a solution to his problems. She was simply a witness to his soul. She, in turn, trusted him with her own vulnerability. She spoke of her family and her loneliness, her fears of being discovered. The guilt was a constant companion, a bitter price for the brief moments of a life he craved. He would sit across from Eleanor at their perfect dining table, listening to her talk about her day, and he would feel a cold knot in his stomach. He wasn't just betraying her with his body, he was betraying her with his soul. The lies were a constant, a fragile web he had to weave every day, and the effort of it left him exhausted. The guilt was a constant companion, a bitter price for the brief moments of a life he craved. He looked at Eleanor, and he saw a stranger, a partner in a well-managed corporation that was failing from the inside out. He had everything a man was supposed to want, and yet he felt like a thief, stealing the only thing that mattered from the one person who gave it to him. Isabella was suffering in her own way. The weight of the secret was a heavy burden on her young shoulders. She was no longer just the quiet, hard-working girl he had first seen. She was weighed down by the secret. He would find her in the kitchen, her hands still as she stared out the window, a faraway look in her eyes. He saw the guilt on her face, a silent accusation against him. He was a man who had everything, and he was compromising the life of a girl who had so little. She was carrying the weight of a secret that was not her own, and yet was entirely hers. The emotional entanglement had made the stakes impossibly high. It wasn't just about the thrill of a forbidden act anymore. It was about love. He had fallen, completely and utterly, for his maid. Not for her body, though he desired it fiercely. He had fallen for her soul, for the way she saw him, for the quiet courage in her eyes, for the genuine, unforced warmth she brought into his cold, desolate life. And she, in her own quiet, brave way, was in love with him. She was in love with the man beneath the perfect facade, the man who was so lonely and so desperate for a connection. She saw him, truly saw him, and she had given him a part of herself he had no right to take. They were addicts, hooked on the quiet moments, the shared glances, the late-night texts, the feeling of being truly known. Their private world was an intoxicating refuge, but it was built on a foundation of sand, with the tide of discovery always threatening to pull it under. He knew, with a heart-wrenching certainty, that a love like that, born of betrayal and stolen moments, could only ever lead to one thing, a kind of beautiful, unspeakable ruin. And he, a man who had always been the master of his own destiny, was now a helpless passenger on a runaway train, heading straight for the cliff. The night was cold and silent, a stark contrast to the burning desire that had consumed Arthur all day. Eleanor was home, a fact that both tormented him and fueled a desperate, reckless hunger. Her presence in the master bedroom, 100 feet away, was a drumbeat of anticipation, a reminder that every moment was a stolen one. He couldn't wait until she was gone again. The need was too raw, too immediate. He sent a single, simple text message: "Study. Now." He knew it was a risk, a final, foolish act of a man who had already lost everything but didn't know it yet. But when he heard the soft click of the door and Isabella slipped into the room, her silhouette a trembling shadow in the dim light, he knew it was a risk he was willing to take. There were no words. The need between them was a thick, electric air they both breathed. The silence was not peaceful tonight. It was a drumbeat of anticipation, a prelude to a storm. He reached for her, his hands finding her face, cupping her cheeks, his thumbs brushing her skin with a reverence that was a mix of sorrow and a consuming fire. There was no gentle unbuttoning tonight, no clumsy fumbling. It was a breathless, frantic urgency, a tearing away of fabric that was more a shedding of their lives than their clothes. The uniform she had worn for months, the symbol of their divide, was ripped from her body and cast to the floor. His expensive shirt, his own armor of respectability, was pulled from his shoulders, and in that moment, in that final desperate act of undressing, they were not a master and his maid. They were two broken people, stripped of every pretense, desperate to feel something real one last time. The sounds were no longer hesitant whispers. They were low, guttural moans, a primal language of release. His hands roamed over her body with a knowing hunger, tracing the curves he had memorized in the dark. He found the soft, heavy weight of her breasts, a sight he had only dreamed of in his cold, perfect life. He kissed them, and she cried out, her head falling back against the leather of the desk chair, her voice a symphony of pleasure and pain. "Oh, Arthur," she gasped, the sound a perfect punctuation to his desperate need. He moved his hands over her stomach, her hips, the soft lines of her body, a testament to a life lived, a truth he was hungry for. The room was a world away from the one where his wife slept. In here, there was only the scent of their heated bodies, the sound of their ragged breathing, and the low, choked murmur of his voice against her skin. "God, Isabella," he groaned, his voice thick with emotion, a sound of pure ecstasy. You're everything I've ever wanted to feel." It was a raw confession, a final, unvarnished truth that he had kept locked away for too long. Her response was a small, shuddering breath, a sob that was swallowed by a rush of pleasure. "My love, my girl," he whispered, giving voice to the feelings he couldn't express. "Yes. Oh, yes," she moaned in return, a final, complete surrender. She was no longer resisting. She was giving a final gift of herself to a man who had finally, briefly, loved her. The climax was a wave of desperate, frantic release, a final, consuming fire that left them both shaken and spent. The storm passed, and the heavy breathing slowed. The room was silent again, but a different kind of silent. It was the silence of a secret that had been fully revealed, of a story that had been told to its final word. He held her, not in triumph, but in a profound, quiet sorrow. The guilt, a quiet poison, began to creep back into his veins, not a fierce stab, but a dull, aching throb, a constant reminder of the price he was about to pay. He looked down at her, her face in the soft glow of the desk lamp, a mix of exhausted ecstasy and quiet, dawning heartbreak. He saw the beautiful, broken person she was, the person he had pulled into his mess. He saw the truth in her eyes, the love that she had given him so freely, and he knew with a heart-wrenching certainty that this was it. The final, reckless act of their beautiful, impossible story. They had reached the cliff's edge, and there was nowhere left to fall. He held her in the stillness, tracing the curve of her hip, the lines of her stomach, the soft, trembling weight of her breasts, committing every detail to memory. He was memorizing a ghost. The scent of their intimacy was still thick in the air, a final, silent testament to their connection. But in his mind, he could already smell the clean, cold scent of Eleanor's perfume, a final, sharp contrast to the human warmth of the girl in his arms. He had found his truth, his warmth, his life, but he had found it in a place where it could never, ever be allowed to stay. He knew that the end was not a choice, it was a sentence. And he knew in his bones that it would be devastating. The final act had been played, and in the silence that followed, a single, terrifying question echoed for Arthur. What now? The fever of their passion had broken, leaving behind a cold, hard reality. The house, which had once felt like their own private world, was now a place of profound tension. Their secret was no longer a source of excitement. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on every moment, every glance, every conversation. The stolen moments had been fleeting, and in their place, a deep-seated dread had taken root. Eleanor, with her usual cool detachment, was the first to notice the cracks. She was a woman who could read the subtle shifts in the art market, the hidden meanings in a collector's smile. She could read a room with a single glance, and now she was beginning to read the fissures in the man she had called her husband for 15 years. She didn't confront him immediately. She observed. She saw that he was distracted, his mind a million miles away when she spoke. His perfect composure, his cool control, had been replaced by a kind of manic energy, a deep, unsettling quietness that was far more unnerving than any anger. She saw the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands would tremble slightly when he held his coffee cup, the way he could no longer meet her gaze for more than a second without looking away. He had become a ghost in his own life, but this time, he was a ghost haunted by a very real, very vibrant memory. The guilt was no longer a quiet poison. It was a crippling, physical burden. He was suffocating on his own lie, a lie that had once felt so alive and now felt so dead. Every conversation with Eleanor was an exercise in pure deception. He would sit across from her at their perfectly set dining table and feel like a monster, a fraud living in a beautiful house built on the foundation of a lie. He would watch her, a stranger with a familiar face, and a cold, bitter sorrow would settle in his chest. The air was so thick with unspoken truth that it felt like breathing through water. The stolen glances between Arthur and Isabella were no longer intimate. They were filled with fear and dread. They were two people trapped on a sinking ship, unable to save each other, unable to save themselves. The look in her eyes was no longer one of love, but a silent question. How much longer can we do this? And in his eyes, she saw the answer. Not long. He started to see the potential consequences with chilling clarity. He didn't just stand to lose his marriage. He stood to lose his entire life, his career, his reputation, the very illusion of control he had spent a lifetime building. He had traded everything for a few stolen moments of life, and the bill was coming due. And then came the tangible evidence. The smallest, most insignificant of things. A final, damning piece of the puzzle that Eleanor's sharp, analytical mind had been piecing together. She was in the master bathroom, a space as immaculate and pristine as a laboratory. She had been picking up clothes from the floor, a single stray pair of his socks, when her eyes caught a flash of something foreign. She found it on the floor, next to the bed, a single, simple hairpin, not like the expensive, jeweled ones she used. It was a pin that was too plain, too humble, to belong in their perfect world. It was a single, tiny, irrefutable clue. Eleanor said nothing. She simply picked it up, her fingers closing around it with a cool, quiet finality. The look in her eyes, when he saw her later that day, had changed. It was no longer a distant, polite gaze. It was a cold, calculated stare of a woman who knows a lie is being told and knows exactly how to find the truth. The house, which had been their refuge and their prison, was now a courtroom. The silence was no longer a matter of emptiness, but of a tension so thick it felt like glass about to shatter. The idyllic bubble had burst. The game of secrets was over. Arthur's guilt was no longer just an internal burden. It was now a shared reality, a quiet presence in every room. He tried to speak to Isabella, to find a way to warn her, to save her. But the words died in his throat. He was a man who had brought a beautiful, innocent soul into a world of lies. And now, he was helpless to protect her from the consequences. He came home that evening to find Eleanor in the living room, the space where he and Isabella had so recklessly exposed their souls to the sun. She was sitting on the white silk sofa, the same sofa where they had made love just a week before. She held a book in her hands, but her eyes were not on the pages. They were on him. Her face was calm, her composure absolute. There was no anger, no fury, just a chilling, quiet certainty. It was the look of a woman who was no longer asking questions, but who had found all the answers she needed. He knew then, in a single, devastating moment, that the end was not coming. It was here. She closed the book slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the table. "Arthur," she said, her voice so calm, so clear, that it was more terrifying than a scream. "We need to talk." And in that single, chilling phrase, the fragile, beautiful illusion of his perfect life crumbled into dust. The final, silent verdict had been delivered. The conversation with Eleanor was not a storm, but a frost. It was colder, more devastating, and left no immediate wreckage, only a profound, chilling silence. She did not raise her voice. She did not throw things or scream. Instead, she spoke with the quiet, chilling precision of a lawyer presenting her case, laying out the evidence in a calm, controlled voice. His changed demeanor, the late nights, his eyes, and finally, the smallest, most damning piece of all, a simple hairpin clutched in her hand. "It's not mine," she said, her voice an arctic calm. "It's not from any of our friends." It's too plain. The word hung in the air, a final, unassailable accusation. Arthur did not deny it. He couldn't. The elaborate lie he had been weaving for months simply collapsed, leaving him exposed in its ruins. He spoke of his loneliness, his emptiness, his life as a beautiful, cold cage. He spoke of a fleeting moment of weakness, a search for something real, something he had lost. He told her just enough of the truth to make the lie sound more plausible. He didn't speak her name. He didn't have to. The ghost of the girl was already in the room with them, a silent witness to his cowardice. Eleanor listened, her face impassive, and then she laid out the final terms. No words were needed. It was an unspoken ultimatum. The life he had built, the perfect facade, or the ruin he had found in the arms of another. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a sentence. The final act was the hardest. He found Isabella in the kitchen, wiping down a spotless counter. She did not need him to say a word. She saw the look on his face, a raw, defeated grief that was more painful than any anger could ever be. He stood in the doorway, a master in his own house, and for the first time he felt small. "Isabella," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry, I can't do this anymore, you can't come back." The words were a brutal, cold end, a final act of betrayal that was even more painful than the first. He was a man drowning, and he was cutting the one person who had thrown him a lifeline. She simply nodded. She didn't cry. The tears had been shed in the fever of their passion. Now there was only a quiet, dignified sorrow. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw a profound, silent understanding of his betrayal. She was not angry at him for what he had done, but for what he was doing now. He was choosing the safe, hollow cage over the terrifying, beautiful reality they had found together. Without another word, she picked up her things and left. He watched from the window as she walked away, a solitary figure disappearing down the long, empty driveway. He felt a tearing, a part of him being ripped away, and in his perfect, beautiful house, he was finally and truly alone. She left as quietly as she came. The next day, her uniform was gone from the hook in the laundry room. Her scent no longer lingered in the air. The house was returned to its immaculate state, and the silence, which had once felt like an invitation, now felt like a punishment. His marriage was saved. Eleanor and he went on with their lives, attending galas, hosting dinners, playing their parts to perfection. The affair was never mentioned again, a secret buried so deep it seemed to have never existed. But for Arthur, the ghost of it was everywhere. He would walk past the library and remember the sudden electric touch of her hand on his. He would sit in the living room and feel the phantom warmth of her body on the sofa. He would lie in bed beside his wife and be haunted by the memory of a simpler, quieter bed and a girl who had made him feel more alive than any perfect life ever could. He had his wife, but he had lost his truth. He had his perfect house, but it was now a prison, every room a monument to his failure. The silence was no longer an absence. It was a presence, a constant echo of a laugh he would never hear again, a touch he would never feel again, a love he had given away for nothing. And in the silence of his perfect, cold house, surrounded by the beautiful things he had created, he realized a devastating truth. He hadn't just lost the maid. He had lost the one person who had ever truly seen him. He had found his truth, his warmth, his life, but he had found it in a place where it could never, ever be allowed to stay. And he was sentenced to live forever in a prison of his own design, a perfect, lonely cell, haunted by the memory of a touch, a whisper, and a quiet girl who had, for a single, terrifying, beautiful moment, made him feel alive.